A little bit faster pace today. We're still on the topic of modesty. Tznius. And we discussed a lot of philosophy. We discussed some examples from the Torah and looking at Hashem and what his example is. We're going to move a lot faster today. I want to cover a lot of material. I don't know if we're going to finish the topic today. I think we'll finish it next time. But today we're going to get through a lot of practical applications as well as practical examples, models from the Torah of where we see tznius, as well as what we're supposed to do, what the Torah has to say, what the Chazal, our sages, have to say about the matter. Please don't hesitate to stop me with questions on the way. Just because I'm going quickly doesn't mean that I don't want to stop and have discussion, because those are often the very best parts of the class, right? And as always, you'll be my devil's advocate today, or anyone else who would like to do that. Okay, so in talking about tznius, we're up to the point where let's look at some models from the Torah of what is considered tznius behavior. Okay, the first real example, and she's probably also one of the best examples of tznius, is Sarah Imenu, our foremother Sarah. It says that in the story of when the angels, the three malachim, come to visit Abraham, they ask him, they say, "Where is your wife Sarah?" Now they know the answer to this because they're angels, but the commentators point out that they're actually trying to praise Sarah to Abraham. In other words, make her more beloved to him, and that's why they ask her, "Where is she?" to give him an opportunity to answer, "Oh, she's in the tent." And he says, "She's in the tent." Okay, the sages say this is a tremendous praise of Sarah, indicating her tznius, that she was not out there, not, in public. She was in her tent, and this is a mark of her tznius, her private, aspect, her private life. By the way, this is not to denigrate her in any way. Again, this is a mark of superiority. Now, how do we know this is a mark of superiority? A little bit later, and we've discussed this a couple times already, we find out that she has a higher level of bina, intuition, as well as a higher level of prophecy than her husband Abraham. In the story, in the event of Ishmael and Yitzchak, where Ishmael is turning out to be a bad influence on Yitzchak, her son, as well as Sarah is realizing he's becoming the one, he's turning out to be not the the correct spiritual inheritor of Abraham. He's turning out to show that he is through his behavior, through his midos, his character traits, that he's not really the right one to inherit the spiritual teachings of Abraham, not the one to become the next, the generation of Bnei Israel, of the Jews. He's not going to inherit that spiritual mantle from Abraham, that Yitzchak is the one to do so. So she tells Abraham, "You need to send Ishmael away. He's not a good influence on Yitzchak. Yitzchak is the correct spiritual inheritor from you." And of course, there's this disagreement between the two of them. And then Hashem has to step in, God has to step in and say, "Listen to her voice. She is the correct one here. She knows better than you. She knows better. She is able to see more clearly the situation." We also talked about how the interesting fact of the matter is that Abraham is the one with the emotional baggage here that is, for some reason, not allowing him to see as clearly as Sarah. But in any event, it is to her praise that the pasuk says that she was in her tent. She's in her tent, meaning, again, not that she is a lesser person than Abraham. She's in fact more insightful, but that this is tremendous praise of her, and the angels want to endear Abraham to her by pointing this out. Okay, just to by the way, just to prove that the issue of being a private person, being a tsunu'ah, is not limited to women, and also, again, the idea that it's not a repressive female thing, is we also have another of our forefathers who is described as being in his tent. Did anyone have a clue about that? No? It says Jacob, who is the grandson of Abraham and Sarah, of course, It describes him, the pasuk describes him as being a simple man and a dweller in tents. Now, the meaning there is that he was, in contrast to his brother Esav, he is a studier, he's a scholar, he spends his time learning. Okay, and that's the point of being in tents, but it's also an interesting parallel to his grandmother Sarah, and I think that's the inherited trait of Tznius, of just learning. And remember, we had the idea also, and I'll discuss it a little later as well, which is that learning Torah should be in private as well, because you retain more. It's not about the showmanship of it. It's not about look how much I know. It's not about looking for praise for learning. It's about doing it in a private way, and that's what he exemplifies as well. Okay, we get a very interesting insight into Tznius when we look at the Kohen, the priest, and their clothing, okay, as well as an actual piece of the tabernacle and the temple, which I'll go into in a minute. But first of all, we know that the Kohen, the priest, wore special clothing, and it was beautiful clothing. It was elaborate. It was there were pants, and then there was a top robe, and then a certain kind of hat. So the first thing is that they were all covered up except their hands and their face. So the idea is that the closer you get to God, the more you have to cover yourself. The holier the closer you approach the holiness of Hashem and his work, the more you have to cover up, the more tznius you have to be. And so they were all covered up as well. Now, as well, we have the idea of the beauty of their clothing, or the specialness of their clothing. And this was for a few reasons. Number one, because it reflected their royal role. Right? We talked about royalty and tznius. As I mentioned, you're never going to see Queen Elizabeth in a bathing suit, right? Because royalty demands a certain dignified clothing, certain dignified way of presenting yourself. So that was one aspect of why the priests were dressed the way they were. Another reason is, of course, to impress us, the people who came to the temple to look at them. We would internalize that special role that they had. So we would look at them and right away recognize this is a special person. This is a person who's doing special work. In a similar way, we sort of internalize that in our own lives with tznius. In other words, that when we dress in a tznius way, we are also presenting the message of, I am an important person. I am royalty. I am someone who values the value of tznius, the character trait of tznius. So that was another aspect of it, to impress upon the viewer that this is a holy person. Because again, when we see how they're dressed, we relate to them in their holy role. We are cognizant of the fact that this is a holy person. This is a person doing holy work. And in addition to that, however, there was also the importance of impressing upon the Kohen himself, right, internalizing that message to the wearer of those special clothing, that he is doing a special job and he has a special role. Just the way that we say that when we are dressed tznius today, we're also internalizing that message of, I am more than just my physicality, and that's the idea of the tznius, right? And the Gemara says an interesting thing. When their clothes were on the Kohanim, their kahuna, their priesthood, was on them. And when their clothes were not on them, they did not have the full kedusha of their kahuna. So there's a tangible, almost a tangible effect on the Kohanim themselves, on the priests themselves, as well as people who beheld them, that when they had their clothes on, they had the full impact of their holiness on them. And again, that translates to us in the way that we have to approach how we present ourselves to the world as well. But here's the fascinating element of tznius relating to the Kohen, the priest, that is connected to an actual vessel of the temple. Now, what am I referring to? One of the main jobs of the Kohen, of course, the priestly duties, was to involved with the sacrifices of the day. There were several, sacrifices that they would give, animal sacrifices and other kinds of sacrifices. So one of the main vessels in the temple was the altar. right? Where they would burn the sacrifices. Now, if anybody is familiar with the way the altar looked, have been diagrams and models made. Can you picture it? Do you know? Are you familiar with it? The altar. How did the Kohen, how did the priest get himself to the altar? How did he reach the altar? It was a high altar, okay? So it was quite a large structure. Reaching up to the top of the altar was a ramp. So the Kohen would reach the top of the altar via a ramp. Now, why a ramp and why not steps, right? A much more logical idea would be to use steps. This is, again, going back to the idea of Tznius. Why? Because even though the Kohen is covered up, he's got pants and he's got a tunic over the pants. The reason is that when if he would ascend via steps, he would be revealing a little bit of his leg. In other words, his tunic would rise up in a little bit of a way, and the Gemara says that it would embarrass the stones. In other words, the steps themselves, it wouldn't be appropriate for the steps to see the Kohen's leg. Okay, now of course this is metaphoric. Obviously stones cannot be embarrassed, right? But the idea is that so much care was taken to impress upon the Kohen and to impress upon the rest of us that even in a little element of, step versus a stride, all right, a step versus a stride, we have to take care. We have to take care to not reveal his leg. Okay. It was also another reason for it, which is kind of related to the idea of Tznius, which is humility versus arrogance, was that he shouldn't sort of, with steps, he would be striding in an arrogant way versus ramp where he's taking smaller steps. He could take smaller steps. In other words, he shouldn't be arrogant in the job, and that was another reason for the ramp. So again, both of those ideas are related to, connected to the idea of Tznius, the arrogance versus humility. Humility being a corollary trait to Tznius, to privacy and modesty. So again, through the Kohen we see the value and how they actually had to act, dress, and be completely in the mindset of Tznius, holiness and privacy covered up. Okay. Another fascinating example from the Torah about the element of Tznius is the incident in which the king of, I think, Moab, Balak, he hires Bilam, who is a pagan prophet, to come and curse the Jews while they're in the desert. The Jews are traveling through the desert. King Balak, right, he's against the Jews, hires the prophet. He was an actual prophet, but he was not a Jewish prophet. It was a pagan prophet named Bilam. He says, go and look out over the Jewish settlement in the desert and curse them. Okay, so he does it. He's hired. He's got to do his job. Bilam goes. He tries to curse them, and he can't. He can't get the words out because God is not allowing him to speak curse words towards the Jews. Tries a second time, it doesn't work. Finally, the third time he tries, and he gets words out, but they're not curse words. They're actually praise words, and this is what comes out of his mouth. We say these words every single morning in the beginning of our prayers every day. Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, mishkanosecha Yisrael. Familiar with that? We teach our kids, and one of the first things we teach our kids, Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, which means, how good are your tents, Yaakov, meaning Bnei Yisrael, the Jews. Mishkanosecha Yisrael, your tabernacles, Israel. So the commentators say, what is he talking about here? What is he seeing that he's praising? He's looking out and literally commenting on what he's seeing. Wow, your tents are so good. Okay, so one of the interpretations given is that he's noticing the way that the Jews had set up their tents. What was so great about the way they set up their tents? That the door to each tent was arranged in such a way that it was not completely facing any other tent. They were askew a little bit so that no tent should be facing, looking into, communicating with any other tent. They were slightly askew. They were this way and that way and that way. And this, again, is praise of the inherent trait of tznius that the Jews had. This idea of privacy, where I don't want to look into another person's private business. It's for this reason, by the way, that we are not allowed to, when we build a house, put a window specifically looking into another's window if we can help it. All right, if we build a house, we're supposed to not do that. Interesting. So again, this idea of that's your private business, my private business. I don't want to look into business that's not my business. That's your private business. Okay. By the way, this is interesting. It's such a fascinating thing that we start our morning prayers with this praise. It's, first of all, it shows us how integral the midah of Tznius is, right? That this is what we're starting with. And it's also amazing because it's the only one of our prayers that was written by a non-Jew. Of course, the words came with the inspiration of God, since he was a prophet, and God put the words in his mouth, but still he was speaking them. So it's interesting. Right. We also see that tznius is an inherited trait. We see that starting with Rachel, our foremother. Now, where did she exhibit the character trait of tznius? We have talked about her story before. Anyone? No? I mean, you should be familiar with what we've talked about her before regarding what the kindness that she did with her sister Leah. But what is the kindness that she did to Leah? Of course, we know the story that when Yaakov wanted to marry Rachel, he greatly suspected his father-in-law was going to pull a fast one, because that's the kind of guy Lavan was. And so he arranged with Rachel before the wedding secret signals, because in those days the brides would come to the wedding veiled, right? That's why we have the badekin today, where the chassan comes and puts the veil over the bride's face to make sure this is the one I'm getting, right? This is you, right? Okay. It all comes from this story of Rachel and Yaakov. Yaakov knew that maybe he's not going to, he wanted to make sure that he was going to marry Rachel under the chuppah there. I don't know if they had chuppah then, but so he gave her secret signals so that when it came time for the ceremony, he would communicate these hand signals, and she would communicate the right ones back, and so they would both know, it's me, it's Rachel. Now, Rachel, of course, her father had told her, you're not marrying Yaakov, it's going to be Leah. We're doing a switcheroo. Yaakov was correct in foreseeing that. And so at this point, Rachel was in a dilemma. Had she said nothing, and the plans would have proceeded, Leah would have been humiliated under the chuppah, because Yaakov would come, give the signals, Leah wouldn't know them. Great humiliation would ensue for her. And so instead, Rachel did a tremendous kindness in telling her sister the signals, the secret signals. And this was a tremendous kindness that she does for Leah. In fact, we talked about how great this kindness was, that centuries, millennia later, when the Jews are on the way out of Israel in the exile of Babylonian exile, they cry. They stand there and cry at Rachel's tomb, so that she should intercede with God on their behalf. And of all the forefathers that come and plead with God, saying, please, on behalf of what I did, please hear my Bnei Israel's, the children of Israel's prayers. The only one that God listens to is Rachel, because of what she did for Leah. Now, so this was a hidden, an act of tznius. In other words, she kept the privacy of this event, the hiddenness of this event. She also never publicized what she did. She kept quiet about it. She didn't tell, according to the commentators, she never even told Yaakov that she did this. I'm guessing he figured it out. But she didn't tell anybody that she did this wonderful thing for her sister. In this merit, the Gemara says, she therefore merited to be the foremother of King Saul, Shaul. Okay, and he as well inherited this trait of modesty. He's called Tznius. And in his merit, I'll go through each of them, but in addition to that, from Shaul came Esther Hamalka, who was also called Tznius. So Rachel we discussed, fine. Shaul, now how is Shaul King Saul? How is he described as someone who has the character trait of Tznius? In two ways, one of which actually saved his life. The first mention of him being someone that has the character trait of Tznius is when he's told by Shmuel, the prophet Samuel, that he's going to be king. He goes back home, and instead of saying, "Hey, Dad, guess what? I was told I'm going to be king," he keeps quiet about it. He doesn't say anything. And this is a mark of Tznius. In addition, when they come and look for him, they draw lots later on and to determine that he would be king. They say, "Where is he? He's missing." He had gone and hidden himself among the stuff, baggage or whatever, the barrels. He had hidden himself because he didn't feel he was worthy of the kingship. So this is a mark, we're told this is a mark of Tznius in Shaul. In addition, how did Tznius save his life? Much later on when he's king. And of course we know about the feud between himself and David, later became King David. David is hiding in a cave. Shaul is chasing after him with his men, and David is running away from him on one of the many incidents in which this happened. David hides himself in a cave. Okay. Now, at this point, halachically speaking, when someone is trying to kill you, you have a right to preemptively kill them in self-defense. Okay, that's just a fact, halachic fact. If someone is trying to kill you, you have a right to preemptively try to kill them. So David would have been allowed to kill Shaul. So what happens? David's in the cave, deep in the recesses of the cave. Shaul and his men come, and they're by the cave, and Shaul has to relieve himself. So what does he do? He goes into the cave to do so. He doesn't do it outside. He doesn't even do it at the mouth of the cave. He goes deep into the cave, almost to the place where David is hiding. And David sees this. David sees the tznius of Shaul. And David, it says, that he had again, despite the fact that he would have been allowed to kill Shaul, says, because of your modesty, I saw the trait of tznius in you, I couldn't kill you at that time. I spared your life because you were deserving to be spared. This aspect of tznius, of privacy, of removing yourself, and especially when it comes to physical actions, was deserving of saving your life. And therefore David, even though he would have been justified in killing Shaul at that point, refrains from doing so. So it saves his life. Now, as a result, as we said, of this trait of tznius in Shaul, what's the opposite of ancestor? What's the opposite of ancestor? I'm blocking. Your great grandchild, Esther, Queen Esther, is also is deserving of royalty, right? Because of this aspect of tznius, where she described as tznuah, she doesn't tell King Achashverosh what nationality she's from, and the commentators mark this also as a trait of tznius. This trait of tznius, this aspect of privacy, of not speaking when she could have spoken, and not telling Achashverosh, her husband, the king, what nationality she's from, later serves to save the Jewish people in the story of Purim, right? So she has this idea of tznius is also about keeping secrets. And again, it's interesting to note, and I'm going to talk about this later when we talk about speech, but all of these instances of tznius with Rachel, with Shaul, with Esther, have to do with Shaul in the first example, have to do with tznius in speech, right? And again, the idea is that this is an inherited trait. We haven't,
that with Esther, that it maybe wasn't tznius, that it was either cleverness or fear that she didn't want to say because then she might not have the position that she had. And then in hindsight, it ended up serving as...
It could be, except that the commentators say that this is an aspect of Tznius, that it was an aspect of it. It could have, those elements could have been in there as well, but she's praised for it as an element of Tznius. Another one more example from the prophets is the book of Ruth, the book of Ruth. When she is in the fields, Boaz, who is the leader of the Jews at the time, she goes into the fields to gather the leftover crops and produce that the poor people were allowed to go and take. Boaz notices she's very different from the other women. She gathers the produce in a very different way, in a very tsanua way, which is that the other women stoop down and pick up what's on the ground. Right? How do you pick something up? You bend over and pick it up. Ruth did not do that. Ruth sat herself down, crouched down on her haunches, or sat down on the ground. So when she lowered herself to the ground so as not to bend over in a less than tsanua way. And he also noticed that she, as opposed to the other women, did not flirt with the men. So there were two aspects to her modesty there. She, as a result of the tsanua, we're told also, the sages say, that she was zocha, she merited being the mother to kings. Of course, from her came King David and King Solomon, David and Shlomo. And the idea is, this is significant, the commentators say, that she deserved to be the mother of kings because of this element of tznius, because a king, specifically that kind of person, needs that inherited trait of tznius. A king, more than any other type of person, needs that trait of privacy, modesty, not being right, to rein in the position of being the leader of the nation, etc. So they need that extra element of tznius. Now, another place we see, fascinating story, another place we see this idea of an inherited trait of tznius comes in, again, in the story of the Jews traveling in the desert. At the time, Hashem says to Moshe, when they're traveling in the desert, that when you're traveling, you may not, there were two pagan nations. Moab was one, and Ammon was another one. And they were nations in the area. Hashem tells Moshe that the nation of both of them you shouldn't provoke. Don't provoke those nations. But if it happens that Moab, the nation of Moab, comes and attacks you, you can certainly defend yourself. You're allowed to defend yourself in any case. But you can, in addition, subjugate them. You can subjugate. You can take servants as slaves as servants from the nation of Moab. However, Hashem says, if the nation of Ammon comes and attacks you, you can defend yourself, but you may not take slaves. You may not make them subservient to you. So the question is, what's the difference between these two nations? They're cousin nations. They actually have one origin in the person of Lot, Avram's brother. But what is the difference? They're very similar nations. They're both pagan nations. They're both idol worshippers. Why can I subjugate people from Moab and I cannot subjugate people from Ammon? The answer lies in their origin, the origin of their nationhood. And again, it goes back to Lot, Abraham's nephew. Lot, remember the story of Lot? The city of Amorah is destroyed. They're told to leave. He leaves with his family, leaves with his daughters and his wife. His wife looks back, by the way, at the burning city. She's told not to. She does, and she turns into a pillar of salt, which I find very interesting because it's also something is there. There's an element there of a lack of tznius. In other words, she's looking back. Why is she told not to look? Why are they told not to look back at the destruction of their city? It's a matter of honoring the people, honoring the dignity of the people. We don't want to look at someone else's destruction. It's not a tznius thing. If I'm going to be watching, it's like gawking at an accident, right, on a highway. We all do it. It's just curiosity. We all do it. But there's an element of, I'm looking into your private business. You're going through something that it should be a private thing. And so she doesn't do that. Okay, anyway, so she turns into a pillow of salt. Lot continues on his way with his daughters. They go into a cave. They think at that point they're totally alone in the world. They don't know anything different. They think the entire world has been destroyed. Lot's daughters then come up with a plan. They say to themselves, look, we've got to perpetuate the species. We've got to continue our father's name. Our father's line has to be continued. So they both decide to seduce their father, have a child with him, and thus they will continue the name of the Lot family. They do this, and of course they do become pregnant, and they each have a child. The older daughter names her son Moav, which means May of, from my father. So she was advertising to the world the origin of this child, which is not an honorable beginning. It's a shameful beginning that I had to seduce my own father. Even then, even to them, it was not an honorable thing. It was it was a degrading thing to do. They thought they had to do it, but still, to blast his name and to advertise where he comes from was a less than tznius thing to do. The younger daughter, on the other hand, named her son Ammon, or Ben Ami, which means son of my nation. So it was couched, again, back then names had meanings. They often indicated what the origin of the child was, or the meaning to the parent. His name a little bit hid his origin. Okay, so therefore she exhibited a tiny bit of tznius in the naming of her son. Right? She exhibited a tiny bit of tznius in the naming of her son by not hinting at the union that created him. For this reason, the nation that resulted from that younger daughter's son, Ben Ami, was the Ammon nation, the Ammonite nation. They inherited this spark of tznius, and therefore they were deserving to be left alone by the Jews. Okay, God is pointing out, there's some inherited spark of tznius that they inherited from their mother, who did have the dignity to not advertise the origin, the shameful origin of that child, and therefore they were protected. They had the right to be protected from the slightest molestation by the Jewish people. Amazing.
But the whole story is so weird.
It is.
No.
It is. Certainly it is. It's a very strange story. The idea that they thought they had to propagate the world, and of course the way they did it was a little bizarre. But nevertheless, they did have, these nations sprang from these two children, and again, the difference in the way that their mothers named them determined something about that, determined the character of the nation. There is this concept that nations have characters. Certainly when it comes to the Jews, we do believe that we have an inherited character. We're told that one of our inherited character traits is tznius. Another of our inherited character traits supposedly is kindness, chesed. Okay, so we do have this idea that a nation can have a character, a certain character trait, and that's what we learn here. The importance of that tznius one was that they merited totally being left alone, not bothered, not subjugated by the Jews. Okay, a couple of other things, and then we'll move on. Prophecy takes place in private. We mentioned that before, including Moshe. When Moshe spoke to God, it was in private, always in private. In fact, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit later on, he's contrasted to his brother Aaron, whose job as the high priest was a very public job. Moshe's job to talk to God was a private job, and Moshe is considered the superior partner in the partnership of Aaron and Moshe. Their jobs were, complementary. Certainly they're both necessary, but Moshe is considered on a little bit of a higher level because his job was to talk to God in private, and while Aharon's was more of a public position. And finally, as I mentioned this before, we're told that in each generation there are 36 hidden saintly people who sustain the entire world. We don't know who they are, they don't know who they are, but they do their job, they plow through their lives, they do good, they don't advertise it, they are tznius, b'tznius, they're acting in b'tznius, which is the way God wants us to do so. So how should we be modest? Any comments or questions on that part? Okay. How should we be modest? What does the Torah say about how we're supposed to act? Okay, so first of all, I want to say a disclaimer here, a little qualifier, that we are not supposed to suppress ourselves, right? Tznius is not about keeping ourselves down, suppressing who we are. In fact, it's the opposite. We're supposed to express ourselves. Tznius actually helps us do that. We talked about that before, how clothing is, appropriate clothing is a way to emphasize my individuality and my innerness by de-emphasizing the physical, right? By de-emphasizing the physical, which is the idea goes back to, again, Adam and Chava in the Garden in Gan Eden. So we're supposed to express our unique selves. We're also allowed to be assertive when we need to, and vocal. There are times to be vocal, there are times to be quiet. So it's not about denying the self, it's just the opposite. We also, by the way, don't think that there's anything wrong with beauty. Okay, this is something we haven't mentioned. You might think, because of all this emphasis on tznius, that the Torah thinks that beauty is a detriment. No, not at all. In fact, 3 out of 4 of our foremothers are described specifically as beautiful. In fact, one of Sarah's names was Iska, related to the word sicha, and the commentators say this is because she could, which means gazing. She had prophecy, but also another meaning is that people would gaze on her because she was so beautiful, right? So, and Esther, of course, is called beautiful. We're told that, again, foremothers are beautiful, not at all something, not even considered a necessary evil. It's a gift from God to be beautiful. And again, it goes back to the idea of our bodies being holy. We're made in the image of God. We know that, right? There's nothing wrong with appreciating beauty. Nothing wrong with appreciating beauty. Okay, so now the nitty-gritty about what it means in our lives, tznius. So first of all, both men and women, by the way, and everything I'm going to say here is about both men and women. Both men and women are discouraged from seeking out positions either in secular life or in Jewish life. Certainly women are not really ever included in the public way in Jewish life, but even in the secular world, when it comes to profession, we're encouraged to not seek out positions where honor or prestige is a prerequisite of the job. Okay, so obviously there are a certain amount of honor and prestige that's going to come with certain kinds of positions, but if honor and prestige is such a prerequisite of the job, then we're discouraged from seeking out those positions. Okay, even in public roles where men are more often, publicity should not be pursued for its own sake. Okay, we are allowed to publicize the greatness of God, and we're allowed to publicize the greatness of the Torah. That's about it. Okay, it should never be a personal issue of, look how great I am. The Gemara talks about eating in the marketplace as the opposite of tznius, an act of tznius, as a public act which is beneath us. Eating in the marketplace. So this means there's a discussion about what this means. It doesn't mean having an ice cream cone in the park. It means, having a full meal while you're walking on the street, that kind of thing. In fact, this is considered so heinous an act. And again, the idea is that because physical acts should be private. Physical acts should be private. It's a concept that is a little bit foreign. And we could understand that, certainly when it comes to the sexual arena, but even eating, which is a physical act, should be kept private. Okay, so it's such a heinous, considered such an unbelievable breach of personal dignity that someone who does this, it says, is not allowed to be a witness in a ritual matter, because the idea is that this person doesn't consider his personal dignity so as important as it should be. So he's not allowed to be a witness in a ritual matter. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara.
We have community dinners.
No. We're not talking about eating with other people. We're talking about eating on the street.
What's the difference?
Well, by the way, you could have the same question about restaurants, right? Right. So the difference is that when you're having a, you can make the same argument about Shabbos dinners with your family, or having guests at your table. It doesn't mean that you can't eat with people. It means that there are appropriate places to eat and there are inappropriate places to eat. A restaurant would be an appropriate place to eat. Even a wedding hall, at an event, at a chasana, at a wedding, at a bar mitzvah, at a function, a school dinner, those are appropriate places to eat because you're joining together to have a seudas mitzvah. You're having a meal of a mitzvah, a happy and joyous time. We're talking about somebody who eats in an inappropriate place. The marketplace, the street, that's not considered an appropriate place.
Driving.
Huh?
Driving, eating a sandwich.
Yeah, driving and eating. How many times do you see somebody in a car and you go, like, have the decency to pull over, at least pull over. Go, get yourself a plate and a napkin, right? It's compared to a dog, actually, eating in the marketplace, because a dog eats whatever he comes upon as he's walking. So the Gemara compares it to the action of a dog. It's a very low kind of behavior. Okay, so that's an element of tznius. Yeah, layout, yeah.
Kosher food and the site on Ben Yehuda Street.
Mm-hmm. Right.
When you eat outside.
Again, we're not talking about restaurants or places that are specifically set aside. If I'm making a little area and I designate it as my lunch area, it's different. It's a little bit different, I think the car example is a very good comparison there. And in general, we're not supposed to do anything that calls attention to ourselves. That's the sort of umbrella idea to how we are supposed to act in tznius. Anything that we do in a deliberate way to call attention to ourselves is not considered tznius. Okay. Now, even in our you look like you have a question. Should I stop and ask?
So
Okay.
karaoke's out, right?
Oh.
Okay.
Well, that gets into a whole other issue, especially when you're talking about women. But even when you're talking about men, I would say, public performance. The question is, what you're asking is public performances. So I would say it's a little bit different there. You certainly have. You'd have girls' schools. My daughter is putting on a production. They're getting up on stage in front of other women only, of course, but they're still getting up on stage and performing. That's really a different kind of idea because it's an entertainment. People are going to enjoy some singing, some dancing. It's a different kind of thing. For women, karaoke is a no-no. We'll get into just because a woman's singing voice is considered nakedness on a woman. Yes, Leah.
Today they filmed. One of the TV stations filmed the Zumba class at Fitness USA,
Mm-hmm.
and I can't think of her first name. Good Nikki usually takes part in the class, and then she saw the camera. She decided, no, I don't want to be on display. So she demonstrated modesty, right?
Absolutely. I mean, exercising it's a very interesting thing when it comes to exercising, and because it looks like more and more these days there are gyms that are either have separate days for men and women, separate hours for men and women, or even completely. Isn't that a women's place? Like it's a women's exercise place, and it's interesting because I think women are definitely more comfortable doing exercises, which is a very physical activity. Stretching their limbs in all kinds of ways, and they just feel more comfortable. Even secular women feel more comfortable in an environment where they know they're not on display, where they know they don't have to worry about the male gaze that they don't really want. They want to do their own thing in private. It's an interesting thing. So yeah, and I don't blame Mrs. Goodnicky. I would also be hiding from the cameras in that way on that day. And the rabbis say that even our performance of mitzvos, when we do a mitzvah, should be b'tznius. Now, why would you think you have to do a mitzvah b'tznius? It's a very odd thing to tell us. right? Because why? Because we would think of all things when I'm doing a mitzvah, when I want to honor God, when I want to do what the Torah says, when I want to do something God wants me to do, I should scream it to the world. I should be proud of it. I should say, look at me, I'm doing a mitzvah. You'd think that you'd be justified, but even when it comes to a mitzvah, you have to be tznius. The rabbis say, for example, we mentioned this, that it's ideal to learn Torah, tznius. That's one thing, right? It's a mitzvah for men and women to learn Torah. And we should do it without seeking praise for doing so, because again, he's going to remember more of what he learns. And why? Because again, when you're focused on the external, you're going to miss the internal. You're going to miss the meaning. You're going to miss the crux of the value of what you're doing. We also know, as another example for a mitzvah, the Rambam, Maimonides, talks about several levels. There's a hierarchy, and from the least ideal to the most ideal. What is the ideal level of tzedakah, of giving charity? That he says the highest level of giving charity is tznius. What does that mean? When both the giver and the receiver are anonymous, meaning that the giver doesn't know who is receiving his money and the receiver doesn't know who gave the money. So again, he enumerates 8 levels of tzedakah, of charity. The highest level is one which is where both sides are totally anonymous. So that's another example of where tznius is valued in a mitzvah. Now, according to the Talmud, the Gemara gives us a couple of examples of how we're supposed to do mitzvahs and tznius. They give the examples of a wedding and a funeral. They pick out these particular mitzvahs as being something we should be extra careful about. Why? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, you could say that at these particular events, you run the risk of overindulging emotionally or overindulging in terms of the spectacle of it, right? Either in a happy way, they're kind of opposite, emotional events. At a wedding, you can get lightheaded, you can be a little silly, you can maybe, you've seen weddings where people really go out of their way to do silly things, and that's okay when you're trying to make the chassan and kala happy, but it can get out of control. Right? It can sometimes get a little bit out of control when we're in an environment like that where there's music and dancing and drinking, a little bit of drinking, l'chaim here, l'chaim there, things can get out of control. So we've got to watch ourselves in this particular situation. And also, in contrast, a funeral where we have to be careful that we don't overindulge in our emotions. We shouldn't be wailing, trying to outdo each other in how sad I am at this event as well. The Gemara also says that in those cases where if you happen to be the one funding the event, sometimes people don't have enough money for a wedding or a funeral and people help out, you shouldn't mention that. Be quiet about it. Don't advertise that you're the one sponsoring the event. Okay. So those are 2 examples that they give. Again, there are instances where you have an ability to get emotionally extreme, and it's not about the fanfare. That's the point. Any comments? Did I see a hand? Okay. There's another example in the Gemara that's unbelievable about this, and the lesson is again about doing mitzvos b'tznius. There's a story of the daughter of one of the figures in Gemara, Rab Hanina ben Tardion. His daughter was walking in the marketplace, and she was known for walking in a very modest way, in a very tznius way. Maybe she took quiet steps, she took small steps. She was known for her tznius, and so she was walking in the marketplace one day. She overheard 2, I think, Roman soldiers, who were talking about, or maybe it was just 2 people who were talking about how modestly she was walking. They were praising her for walking in such a tznius way. When she heard this, she made sure to improve on her tznius even more. She went out of her way, in other words, to go further than necessary, to outshine herself and be even more modest. This made her deserving of punishment. This was not a praiseworthy thing. Because again, what is she doing? She's doing the opposite in trying to be more modest. She's trying to she's trying to show how modest she could be. There's a contradictory kind of situation. Again, you don't have to. We talked about this idea relating to the idea of that you cannot show yourself to be more righteous than the rest of the world. We talked about that in regards to someone who wants to wear mourning clothes for Jerusalem all the time. A person is not allowed to do that. You can't walk around in mourning clothes for Jerusalem, because the point is you're trying to show how holy a person you are, how righteous a person you are, by mourning all the time for the fall of the loss of Jerusalem. You're not allowed to do that. You can't show yourself to be more holy than everybody else. It shows a lack of tznius. It shows, look how great I am. This is something similar, where she was walking in a tznius way and then wanted to improve on that, but the improvement actually achieved the opposite of what she was trying to accomplish, and she was punished for that.
What happened?
Yeah.
I don't know the actual punishment. I don't know the actual punishment. I'm trying to remember if it had to do with, I think it has to do with the loss of money, but I'm not positive about that. I can check up on that. Okay. It says that Torah scholars need to be extra modest in their clothes and behavior. And again, this goes back to the idea that the more holy you are, the closer you are to God, the more you need to be acting and dressing with tznius, as we had the example of the Kohanim, the priests. We want to emphasize their holiness. We don't want to detract from their holiness by emphasizing externals. The Gemara says that the clothes of a Talmud, of a wise scholar, is a long dress over his suit of clothes to hide his body. So that even when it comes to a man, okay, certainly we're not, again, this proves that it's not all about women, that it's about men as well. And even a Talmud Chacham, a scholar, a wise scholar, is someone who has to cover themselves even more, because they have a stronger connection to holiness. The stronger the connection to holiness, the more you have to cover up. This also is going to relate to women, and I'm going to talk about women next week. I don't think we'll get to it this week. Barbara?
So how do they cover themselves up more today?
So today, you will see the Gedolim, the great people of the generation. They're usually wearing not only a suit of clothes, but a lot of times for a jacket, instead of a short jacket, they're wearing a long jacket. And interestingly enough, the Gemara tells the story of one rabbi who had a beautiful robe on, and his talmidim, his students, didn't let him, or his colleagues, didn't let him wear it because it was sheer. It showed his body, it showed the shape of his body. I don't know exactly what it was. They said it's not tznius, it's not a modest dress. So yeah, so there is this. If you look at pictures of great rabbis, a lot of them are dressed in a long jacket as opposed to a short jacket. Yeah.
Isn't that then going one step further, just like that young girl did, just to be more tznius?
Right.
What's the
Right.
difference?
That's interesting. That's an interesting point. I would say that the difference is that as with when it comes to women's fashions and styles and traditions in terms of how we dress and tznius, and we'll talk about that next week a lot in depth. As with that, there is a concept that I'm guessing this would apply to rabbis as well. If it is traditional for a rabbi to wear a certain garment, if it's traditional for a rabbi to wear the garment, then it's not out of place for a rabbi to wear that garment. In other words, this is what's become standard. The Gemara, going back to the Gemara says this is what Torah scholars should wear. Therefore, when a Torah scholar today wears it, it's not out of place because we're told this is appropriate. Okay, as opposed to someone who is, in today's day and age, let's say a woman who wears a burqa. That's the perfect example. One of the reasons that rabbis are against Jewish women wearing a burqa is this is not the tradition of Jewish women throughout history, except in Muslim countries where they had to, because that was the style of the secular society. But other than that, we don't require a burqa. So to go out of your way to wear a burqa is showing that you consider yourself holier than other people, that the Torah says you can show your face and hands, but no, for you, you can't. You see what I'm saying? There's a little bit of difference there. Okay. Where are we on time? Okay. Interesting. I find an interesting parallel also in when men get an aliyah and they cover their heads with the talis. Now the reason is that they're concentrating on the bracha. I think there is a corollary idea here. They're concentrating on the bracha, but they want to block out the world. When they're davening as well, they want to block out the world. And again, this is a similar idea to the idea of wanting to learn Torah in private, so that it penetrates your head, penetrates your heart. What you're saying, the words that you're saying, is going to be accepted by you in a way that that somehow when you don't have your head covered or you're not concentrating as well, the words don't penetrate to your neshama. And I think this is a similar idea. Even when we're alone, it says we should not be walking around naked. Halach says that you shouldn't, even when you're private, and that the idea there is that we have to have a recognition that God is always with us.
Well, how about a mix?
No, so obviously there are times. No, I'm not talking about times when you need to. I'm not talking about when taking a shower, right? I'm not talking about times when obviously you need to undress. You're allowed to undress, but even when it comes to those times, what I was referring to was, there's some people who like to walk around the house undressed. They feel, we shouldn't be doing that. We should have a sense that God's presence, God is with us all the time, and that even in our homes, there's a great story about a woman in the Gemara who earned the merit of having several sons of hers be high priests, and they asked her, what is this great thing that you did to deserve this? And she said, the walls of my house never saw my hair. Meaning that she kept her hair covered inside as well as outside. And so there's this idea that Tznius doesn't stop at the door. Tznius is not just when I'm outside, it's also in my house, because again, we want to internalize the message. We want to internalize the message that I want to be my neshama. I want to be my soul. I want to be identified on a spiritual level, even to myself.
Isn't that the pasuk that women go to that shave their head?
Mm-hmm.
I think it originates from that pasuk. That women that shave their head under a tichel or a sheitel,
Right.
because of that pasuk, that the walls never see my hair.
I'm not sure about that. There's a real argument about women who shave their heads. It's not. First of all, it's not a mainstream thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a mainstream Jewish thing to do. There's nowhere that says we have to do it. It's limited to a very specific small group of Jewish people, and specifically a Hasidic group of Jewish people. And there is some debate about whether or not that's, in fact, even among the group that does it, there's I think, the guideline that if your husband does not want you to do it, you should not do it. You should not do anything to make yourself ugly in your husband's eyes. And so that's an extremity that, again, it's limited to a specific community. Mm-hmm. So therefore, it's a standard that might be okay, but it's debatable whether it's really the right to do. So
My question always comes with Tznius is, how are wigs Tznius? We can talk about that next week.
I guess. I
have never gotten a completely satisfactory answer to that. So
Okay.
I ask it again.
Can we table it? Can you remember for next week?
I'll
Okay.
remember.
Okay, please do. Okay.
If I had a pretty wig, I'd look like $9.
Okay.
Instead of
Okay, I think we're going to stop here. That takes us to an hour.